Do you all know about this? 50 years ago, in the 1970s, TV broadcasting was stopped at night due to lack of electric power, and neon lights were turned off, making the downtown area dark in Japan. Yes, that's right. This was due to the first and second oil crisis. The Japanese economy, which was in the midst of rapid growth at that time, was disrupted by the energy shortage, and then our daily lives were greatly affected. Japan has experienced several major events in the past, including oil crises, that have shifted its energy policy and subsequently changed the power supply structure in Japan. In today's energy talk, I will discuss these events as well as the history and an evolution of power supply structure in Japan. As many of you know, electricity was first generated in Japan in the Meiji era, late 19th century. At an early stage, electricity was mostly generated by hydropower. As the demand for electricity increased with Japan's rapid economic growth, thermal power generation began to overtake hydropower generation in the 1960s. Since then, the robust demand for electricity has met mainly by thermal power generation, and power generation capacity has rapidly increased to 10 million kilowatt. By the way, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has caused the power supply demand crunch, and this winter we were being asked to conserve electricity again. But as I mentioned at the beginning, there was a time when we had even greater power shortages in Japan than we have now. It was about 50 years ago when the Fourth Middle East War and the Iranian Revolution brought about two oil crises in 1974 and 79 respectively. At that time, Japan relied on oil-fired thermal power for 90% of its electricity generation, which caused fuel prices to skyrocket and electricity rates to rise by 50% twice. In addition, since Japan was heavily dependent on the Middle East, it became difficult to obtain fuel. TV broadcasting was stopped at night to save electricity, and neon lights were turned off. Japan, which was in the midst of its rapid economic growth, was severely damaged. This experience was used as an opportunity to break away from dependence on imported oil from the Middle East. The transition from dependence on oil to gas began. The introduction of natural gas imports in the form of liquefied natural gas, LNG, began. To break away from dependence on the Middle East, the first LNG import came from Alaska, followed by the diversification of import sources to include Indonesia, Brunei, Malaysia, and Australia. In addition, nuclear power generation expanded significantly starting in the early 1970s and growing to account for 30% of Japan's total power generation in the 21st century. As a result, Japan had a power source mix of 1/3 LNG, 30% nuclear, 20% coal-fired, less than 10% hydropower, and a few percent oil, thus achieving diversification along with fewer import sources. During this period, electric demand grew steadily, and in particular, the peak demand grew tenfold in 40 years, from 20 million kilowatt in the early 1960s to 200 million kilowatt in the year 2001. Therefore, the biggest challenge for electric power company was how to maintain supply capacity over the long term in order to meet such a strong power demand. However, the Fukushima nuclear accident occurred in March 2011, and all nuclear power plants were shut down. The tsunami also caused extensive damages to thermal power plants on the Pacific coast, and immediately after the disaster, we experienced rolling blackouts due to a lack of power generation facilities. As a result, power generation facilities were urgently shifted back to thermal power again, and for a time, nearly 90% of power generation relied on thermal power again. At that time, global warming was already a major issue, and Japan's CO2 emissions rose sharply with the suspension of nuclear power plants. 12 years have passed since the accident, during which solar power generation has grown significantly to account for nearly 10% of power generation, and 10 nuclear power units have restarted generation, and CO2 emissions have begun to drop slightly. Nevertheless, the dependence on thermal power generation has plateaued around 70%, and further reduction of CO2 emissions will require an increase in non-fossil power sources such as renewable energy and nuclear power. As described above, the structure of Japan's power supply has been greatly affected by two major events: the oil crisis and the Fukushima nuclear accident. Although there were rolling blackouts immediately after the nuclear accident, they ended after about 2 weeks. And then I can say that Japan has managed to maintain its most important mission of a stable electric supply during this period of economic growth. I believe that this was largely due to the efforts of consumers who cooperated in saving electricity on an emergency basis, as well as the diligent effort of power companies to maintain a stable supply of electricity over the long term. In the next energy talk, I'd like to share with you the efforts and innovations that Japanese electric power companies have made in order to provide a stable supply of electricity on a daily basis. Everyone, stay curious about energy. Thank you very much.